Hey everybody, this is Dale from the Precept classes in Cullman, Alabama, and I'm so glad that you have joined with us. We're looking at 1 Samuel right now, and we're up to lesson 5, and boy, these lessons are getting sort of long chapter-wise. They're not hard at all, but they just take a period of time to get through. And so, as you know, we try to keep these videos under 10 minutes because we put them on YouTube and all that kind of stuff. So let me just give you everything that's happened at this point in time in 1 Samuel, and then you make sure you go back and study and look at the details. Chapters 1 through chapter 7 talks about Samuel. Samuel was the last judge. That's one way of looking at it, okay? Chapter 8 through chapter 15, which we've covered the last couple of weeks, is where we see that Saul is the first king. Now, chapters 16 through chapter 20, we're going to see that David is anointed as the next king. But there's so many principles to hang on to here. Here's a biggie. David was anointed as king of Israel, and he was positionally king of Israel. But it was years and years and years before he ascended to the throne. Might have been 15 years, might have been even longer than that. And during that whole time, as we're going to see, David did not touch the anointed of God. That's a major thing for us to see. In today's lessons, chapters 16 through 20, here's the big picture. Chapter 16, Samuel anoints David in Bethlehem, and the Spirit comes upon David in that day and is with David from that point on. Chapter 17 is a story that we're very familiar with, but don't let that familiarness rob you of the truth that's in it. It's where David killed Goliath. Chapter 18, we see that Saul tries to kill David. Chapter 19, Jonathan and Michal, David's wife, saved David from Saul's plans. And then chapter 20, we see that Saul said that David must die. And when you look at these chapters all together, you see that Saul tried in a multitude of ways to kill David. He tried to kill him himself, sent men to kill him, tried to kill him in battle. Saul was acting very foolishly, and he didn't keep the commandments of the Lord. Therefore, the Lord had told Samuel that his kingdom's not going to last. The Lord was seeking for somebody whose heart would be after him. And so after the incident we saw last week with the Amalekites, the kingdom was torn from Saul. That doesn't mean that Saul ceased to be king, but the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, and something worse than that came upon him. An evil spirit came upon him, and you see that this week. So in chapter 16, here's just the detail, some of the few details. The Lord told Samuel that the Lord was going to select for himself a king from Jesse's son. So Samuel goes to Bethlehem. God tells him how to do it, and he comes forth all the sons of Jesse, and he looks at him. And it's sort of interesting because Samuel looks at the first one and says, oh, this must be the king because he's tall and he's good looking, right? Goes through all the kids, all the boys. None of them are the one. And so finally Samuel has to ask Jesse, hey, is there somebody, you got another kid? And Jesse says, yeah, I got the youngest one. He's out there watching sheep, but he's just a young, ruddy kid. He said, bring him in here. He's the one. And so he anointed him, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. That's interesting because in light of everything we're going to learn about David down the road, we still know that the Spirit is upon him. But you see the contrast here because the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, and another contrast, the Lord sent an evil spirit. Now, people get real bent out of shape with that. Let me just tell you what the bottom line is. The bottom line, the primary point is that God is in control of everything. And so the Lord would send this evil spirit upon Saul. Saul would be overtaken by apparently fear and anxiety. Something would happen. David would come and play the harp for him, and it would calm him down. The evil spirit would depart from him. Chapter 17 is the great story of David and Goliath, and so make sure you're ready to get the details. But David was going to bring some victuals, some food to his brothers. He comes and he finds out what's going on. Goliath, this great gigantic man, the soldier of the Philistines, would come out every day and was declaring, let's just do this one-on-one, mano a mano, me against your number one man. And nobody would step forward. What's really bad about it, it so depressed the army of Israel because it wasn't the army's decision to do this. Saul should have been the one who had stepped forth in the power of the Lord and gone to fight Goliath, but he didn't do it. He was hiding. And you see that a lot with Saul. He's hiding in his tent. He's sitting under a shade tree, sitting there with a spear, got the army around. You're going to see this more and more and more. They were looking at an outward appearance, and there was great dismay and great fear. Well, here comes David bebopping into this. Here's what's going on, sees what's happening, finds out that there's great riches and promises of no taxes, freedom for the father's house, a daughter in marriage to whoever kills this guy. Well, that's attractive. But David was greatly offended by what Goliath was saying. He's saying, hey, he's besmirching the armies of God here. Why didn't somebody go up there and take care of this? Well, David's brothers are making fun of him because of all this kind of stuff and said, what are you talking about? You're just here to cause trouble. Well, then Saul hears about this, young man who's saying this stuff, calls him in, and David is trying to encourage Saul, say, hey, who's this that's taunting the armies of God? And Saul said, well, you're just a youth, you don't understand. And David said, I can take him out. And Saul says, well, go ahead and try it. And so they put on the armor. You've read that whole story there, and it just doesn't fit. And there's a great principle. Don't try to put on other people's weapons of warfare. Use what the Lord has given you. Okay? That's where we as the body of Christ so mess up. We think we have to be like a preacher, like somebody else, or we have to be a musician like somebody else, and we don't realize that God is calling us to fight the way that He's calling us to fight. You know the story. David goes out. He's victorious. He kills Goliath, cuts his head off with his own sword. That rallies the rest of the army of Israel, and they go and they send the Philistines fleeing all over the place. Chapter 18 is after this, and after at the end of chapter 17, when David is speaking to Saul, that Jonathan and David's hearts are knit together, and they made a covenant with one another. It's a very poignant thing right here. Jonathan gives his robe and his armor and all these other things that are symbols of his kingship. See, Jonathan would have been the next king. But he lays it before David and says, I'm making a covenant with you. And he's basically saying, I know that you're going to be the next king. And they do this several times. Jonathan and David have these covenant moments. They're just saying, hey, we know that we are of one spirit. So in chapter 18, you see that anger and jealousy is building up inside Saul, the thing I was talking about a while ago. He actually tries to pin him, tries to kill him, tries to do all this kind of stuff. And it gets worse and it gets worse. And chapter 19, you see that Saul has told those around him to try to kill him. But Jonathan warns him and says, why are you doing this? So Saul listens to his son temporarily. And he allows David to come back and play for him some. But there's war in the Philistines. He sends David out. David winds up being a mighty leader and commander. Saul was hoping that David would get killed, but David does better, and he does better. And so it was getting so bad, though, that David knew he had to leave. So he leaves and he goes to, into chapter 19. He stays with Samuel in Ramah. Now, quickly, the last chapter, chapter 20. And this is sort of interesting because David leaves, but he comes back. And there's an interesting thing right here. He tells Jonathan and says, I got to get out of here because your father's going to try to kill me. And so they come up with this elaborate thing to prove whether this is true or not. And the entire 20th chapter deals with this. And the bottom line is that, yes, Saul reveals the intention of his heart to his son. And Jonathan realizes, wait, my father has lied to me. He has no intention of adhering to what that promise of not harming David. And it was such an anger that burned against Jonathan, against David, that Saul even tried to kill Jonathan. So Jonathan comes back and he meets David in the field as they agreed to do. You've read the story about the little boy, the arrows and chasing and that kind of thing. And the whole point of that was that Jonathan would never have traveled alone if he was unable to get away. That he had to have some way of being able to communicate with David to tell him what's going on without actually seeing him. But God saw fit to give Jonathan and David one of their last opportunities they would have to be together and express the covenant of love they had for one another. And that Jonathan had David promise that he would take care of his descendants. You'll see that in 2 Samuel, that he does that. In this account, you see that the Lord anoints the next king, David, that the Lord is preparing him. We're going to see more and more of that preparation and what he does to do that. But we see the faithfulness and the obedience of this young man who's simply doing what God is telling him to do. That's what the Lord's calling us to do, to fight and to battle, to walk in trust and obedience with him in the way that he's called us individually. Okay, us individually. And you say, well, how do I discern that? You discern it the same way that David did. He worshiped the Lord in purity of spirit. He spent time with the Lord. He depended upon the Lord, and he knew that it was by the name and the power of the Lord that he would be victorious over Goliath. Let us live in the same way. Again, I'm Dale from the Precept classes in Cullman, Alabama, and I'll see you again for the next lesson.